Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. For educational and resource providing purposes, we will be recording this webinar to use it as a resource to encourage and educate future youth advocates. The webinar will begin in just a few moments, but in the meantime, for those who are here and slowly logging on, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Share your name, location, and what brought you to this youth advocacy webinar. All right. We're going to give people just a couple more minutes, and then we'll be getting started. In the meantime, please feel free to share your name, location, and what brought you to this youth advocacy webinar in the chat. All right, I think we're going to get ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Youth Advocates Against FGC, a conversation on change. We are honored to have you join us as we bring together passionate young advocates dedicated to ending female genital cutting, or FGC, and championing human rights. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded to serve as a resource for current and future youth advocates. FGC remains a persistent challenge worldwide, affecting millions. Although generations before us may have upheld or practiced FGC due to cultural or social norms, today's youth have taken on the responsibility to end this cycle. Young advocates like those joining us today are standing at the forefront of this movement, challenging deeply rooted traditions and advocating for the rights and safety of future generations. In many ways, advocacy against FGC is part of a larger historical narrative where young people, especially, have taken the lead in driving social change. Throughout history, youth have been the heart of movements for justice and equality, pushing forward creative solutions, breaking down barriers, and refusing to accept harmful norms. And as we define youth here, ranging from 18 to 35 years of age, these are people who may be navigating complex roles as they take on challenges or stand firm against patriarchal norms that sustain practices like FGC. Today's discussion highlights the power of youth-driven advocacy, the importance of sharing knowledge across generations, and the unique perspectives that young people bring to this issue. Our goal is to create a safe space for our speakers and attendees to exchange experiences, foster empathy, and strengthen our networks. Thank you all for being here and participating in this discussion. And as we continue forward, please feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat. Remember, share your name, location, and what brought you to this webinar. Moving forward to the next slide. As a disclaimer, please be advised that today's webinar will involve discussions on female genital cutting, which might include personal testimonies and discussions that could be triggering or deeply emotional for some participants. These conversations are important for understanding the complexities of FGC and the activism against it, but we recognize that they can also be challenging to hear. Moving forward, I will be your moderator this afternoon. My name is Umme Kulsoom Arif, and my pronouns are they/them. I am a Daldi Bora survivor of FGC who has been volunteering with Sahiyo since I was in law school. On to the next one. I am a writer, activist, and academic counselor living and working in St. Louis, Missouri. I currently work for St. Louis University and have been working to empower youth activists and platforming queer and non-binary survivors of FGC so they can feel safe adding their voice to the narrative without shame or silence. Moving forward. Before diving into our agenda for the day, we are going to launch a quick poll just to learn more about your familiarity on the topic of FGMC and what brought you here today. The poll will continue running throughout the course of our webinar. And now onto our agenda. First, please feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat box. We have a few speakers here with us today that I'm going to introduce and you will get to know more about during the panel, some of whom are alumni of Sahiyo's Voices to End FGMC program. We will also be presenting the stories they created during the Voices workshop, shedding some light on what youth activism can look like and their individual motivations. Afterwards, we'll jump into our panel discussion with an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. So please feel free to share any questions you might have throughout our discussion, and we'll keep track of them. For those who might want to ask questions anonymously, we invite you to use Zoom's direct messaging option to message myself or our training and technical assistance coordinator, Arias Nuno. We'll try to get to as many as we can before our time today runs out. And finally, we'll wrap up with some closing items and share some resources you might find interesting related to youth voices in addressing FGMC. Moving forward, a little bit about Sahiyo. Sahiyo formed in 2015 as an advocacy collective of South Asian and other survivors of female genital cutting, also known as female genital mutilation, to address the lack of acknowledgement of FGC as gender-based violence and child abuse impacting U.S. women. Sahiyo empowers in underrepresented communities to advocate for their inclusion within FGC discourse and supports them to create systemic change to end this centuries-long practice. Sahiyo utilizes collaborative grassroots campaigns and storytelling techniques to train communities to lead this change. Sahiyo also partners with frontline workers, like healthcare providers, to create culturally sensitive systems of care for survivors and with the government to address policy-level change. Moving forward, the first Voices story we're going to share is actually the story I made back when I participated in the workshop. The story is titled Writer's Blood. I invite any to share thoughts or reflections on this story in the chat.
Who are you, really? I have a confession to make. I'm a thief. I may even be a murderer. My body does not belong to me, this stolen shell subjected to the great misfortune of a consciousness it was not meant to have. An imposter. One moment you are a whole person, and then you close your eyes and are transported into another, a near perfect copy, with probably no idea what has become of your original self, one who has no idea you are no longer you. One moment you are 5 years old, and a gloved hand is wiping away your tears while you lay, cold and afraid, on a metal gurney bed in a metal room with a metal needle pouring unwanted sleep into your tiny veins. You blink, a moment passes, and you teleport into a recovery room warmed by the sun, flanked by your grandmothers. You are a near-perfect copy of the 5-year-old in that metal room, on that metal gurney bed, the one who has no idea she is no longer you, the one you left behind. I hate her, love her, envy her. In another universe, abandoned decades worth of light years back, is a girl who is still a girl whose parents must make an impossible choice. Turn away from all they have ever known and preserve the wholeness of a girl who is still a girl. Traverse into the unknown dark of loneliness with a whole daughter by their side. Or kill her and pretend the imposter they build is the proper one. Destroy the memory of the original, dead on the metal gurney bed, and never let her know of the timeline where she is still she, still a choice. It will not be the last time I die, not the last time I will lay on a cold metal table and count to black, only to wake up a copy of the version before me, a little less than I was when I went to sleep. But it will be the only time someone else chooses to kill me.
Thank you all. Now join me in introducing our panel speakers. First up is Hunter Kessous. Hunter is a second-year candidate for a combined MD, MPH degree at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine with nearly 8 years of nonprofit and research experience in gender-based violence, particularly female genital mutilation/cutting. Her current research aims to elucidate the health and social impacts of undergoing an unwanted additional stitch following a tear or episiotomy in childbirth, also known as the husband stitch. She aspires to pursue an OBGYN residency and aims to continue working with underserved populations, especially survivors of gender-based violence and the LGBTQ plus community. Hunter is similarly an alumni of Sahiyo's Voices to End FGMC program, and we are going to share with you all the digital story she made during the workshop. Hunter, is there anything you'd like to add before going into this video?
Hi, thank you all for being here. No, nothing to add.
All right, thank you. We'll dive into the video next. We're going to watch Hunter's story, Challenging Ideas.
I first learned about female genital cutting in a book I was reading when I was 16. My heart was in my throat as I read through every detail, and I immediately knew I wanted to work to end this practice. While I was in high school, whenever I brought up this topic, people said, "What is FGC? I've never heard of that." So that was the response I came to always expect. Then I got to college. I was a sophomore when FGC was actually mentioned in a class I was taking. The teacher asked, "Does anyone know what FGC is?" One student gave a definition, and other students shared their thoughts too. The problem was that there was a lot of misinformation in what they shared. One said it's a necessary religious practice. Another person claimed it's not that harmful if it's just a prick. And FGC is an African practice, so it should be up to them if it continues. Hearing these students who were just like me defending cutting shocked me. Anger, sadness, and confusion boiled up inside me. I held my friend's hand under the table to keep my emotions inside. But I did have to speak up. My friend and I said that FGC is not a religious requirement, it's a human rights violation, and all forms of it are really damaging. But I got the sense that they didn't really hear us. I learned later that the misinformation these students had shared were things they learned from professors at my school. I was really upset that such trusted sources would pass along this kind of incorrect information. These students weren't monsters who wanted little girls to be cut. It's similar to what happens in communities that continue FGC. When people we trust, our family, our community leaders, our teachers, tell us that something is good or important, we feel like we have to believe them. I learned that day that the movement to end FGC needs to include raising awareness among everybody about the harms of this practice. I also learned that it's important to challenge ideas, even when they come from the people we look up to.
Thank you so much, Hunter, for your wonderful story. As always, you are welcome to share your thoughts and perspectives in the chat as we continue forward. Our next panelist is Nur Bookwala, pronouns she, her. Nur is currently a law student at Columbia University. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Biology from the George Washington University. For her undergraduate senior thesis, she worked under the mentorship of Dr. Karen McDonald to conduct a qualitative research study on FGC and stigma in the Nbua community. She interviewed 10 women from the community on their knowledge and attitudes of and about the practice. Nur, is there anything else you'd like to say about yourself as a panelist?
Nothing now. I'm excited to be here. And I think the rest of my story will come out when we answer some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nur, for being here. Our next panelist is Saza Faradilla. Saza is a co-founder of End Female Genital Cutting Singapore. She spearheads initiatives to increase awareness on FGC, lobbies local and international leaders, and conducts research on FGC in Singapore. Saza is also an alumni of Sahiyo's Voices Project, and we wanted to take a moment to share Saza's story, seemingly innocuous cut. Before jumping into our video, is there anything you'd like to add about your introduction, Saza?
Yeah, so I'm from Singapore, but right now I'm based in Chicago, and just because I see a couple of people who are in Chicago as well, so if you are keen to connect, feel free to PM me, and we can set something up. I'm in Chicago until the end of November. Yeah, that's all.
Fantastic. Now we're going to watch Saza's story, a seemingly innocuous cut. And again, if you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the chat.
Saya berdiri di tepi jalan, memakai pakaian ringkas, kemeja tee dan seluar jeans, menunggu ayah menjemput saya dari universiti. Kami sedang menuju ke rumah ibu saudara untuk acara ulang tahun sepupu saya Anissa yang berumur 2 tahun. Assalamualaikum, saya ucapkan semasa memasuki kereta. Ibu bapa dan kakak saya membalas, Waalaikumsalam. 20 minit kemudian, kami tiba di rumah ibu saudara. Dan terus terbau aroma masakan rendang, lodeh dan sambal goreng yang enak. Rumahnya penuh berwarna-warni. Daripada baju kurung merah dan biru kepada jubah hijau dan juga abaya hitam. Saya mengambil makanan untuk ibu dan diri saya. Dan kami duduk sambil menikmati makanan lazat. Makcik saya membawa sepupu saya yang comel dan dengan bangganya berkata, dia disunatkan minggu lepas. Mata saya terbeliak. Tulang belakang saya menjadi lurus. Saya hampir terjatuh dari sofa. Dia disunat? Anak perempuan disunat? Saya bertanya. Saya tidak boleh percaya jawapannya. Ya, minggu lalu oleh seorang doktor. Cepat sekali. Snip, dah habis pun, makcik saya menjawab. Tetapi ini melanggar hak kemanusiaannya. Ini salah, saya menjerit. Kakak saya memotong perbualan kami. Dia berkata, kamu juga disunat semasa kamu kecil. Mulut saya digantung terbuka. Itulah saatnya saya sedar tentang sunat perempuan dan saya mendapat tahu ia telah berlaku kepada diri saya. Tetapi, mengapa? Untuk apa? Saya menanya ibu. Ibu menjawab, dalam Islam, perempuan patut disunat. Cara ini lebih bersih. Dan kamu tidak akan berzina. Pada saat itulah, saya memutuskan untuk mencabar mitos-mitos sebegini dan melindungi anak-anak perempuan lain di Singapura. Dan sejak itu, saya telah berkempen untuk menghentikan amalan sunat perempuan.
Thank you, Saza, for your very powerful video. Moving on to our next panelist, Atiqah Suhaimi. Atiqah is a former diplomat with the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs and holds a master's degree in international relations from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, as well as a bachelor's degree in psychology from Nanyang Technological University. Originally from Singapore and now based in Hawaii, she is dedicated to raising awareness of and advocating to end female genital cutting, a practice that affects communities in both regions. Her passion for this cause drives her commitment to fostering change and promoting human rights. Atiqah, is there anything else you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Umi. I'm just so excited to be here today, and thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully my story will come out later as we have our discussion.
Fantastic. Now we're going to stop sharing our screen and go into our panel discussion. In the event we are not able to answer everyone's questions, please be sure to keep an eye out for our newsletter and on Sahiyo's Instagram for more answers from our panelists. All right, so we're going to start diving into the questions. If you have additional questions, please feel free to use the chat to send them. If you would like to send them anonymously to myself or to our training and technical coordinator, Arias Nuno, please feel free to do so. Our first question is open to all of our panelists. How have you seen youth engagement impact the movement to end FGMC, whether in your own communities or the broader movement? Is there anyone who'd like to go first? Hunter, what about you?
Sure. I think that youth are so essential to this movement. And in my own experience, and I think also in the experiences of the other panelists, we have resources available to us through our universities and our graduate schools. And I think that's something that is a really strong way that youth are able to contribute to this movement. So for me, I've been able to take advantage of some resources at the library having an IRB, an institutional review board institution, has enabled me to be able to do research. And research is so critical because there's still so much we don't know about FGM. So research is really important. I think youth, especially ones in academic institutions, are very well positioned to do that kind of work. So I know I myself have been working on research. I believe Nur has as well. So that's one way I can think that youth are really essential and able to contribute to this movement.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Nur, would you like to contribute as well?
Yeah, just following up on what Hunter said. I mean, I think I've seen youth engagement also through the generation. So like started with my grandmother and then it was my mom, and I'm the first person who's been like public about it in my community. And so I see how even just each generation, you can push the boundary when you're like a youth. So English, yeah, when you're young, you can push the boundary a little bit more each time, where like my mom can't anymore, my grandmother can't anymore. And so I've seen like how like youth engagement can really just bolster like the cause. Yeah.
I can build off that. So in my work, I've seen how, I guess, youth engagement, but also in an intergenerational way. So at NFGC Singapore, we have about 5 or 6 core team members, and one of our members is above 60 years old. The rest of us are like 35 and below. And I think when speaking about FGMC in our context, the people who are most hardline about it are the older generation. And so it's also important, I think, for youth to engage people who are older, to also have that conversation with them. Maybe they might not really come from a human rights perspective, but perhaps they come from more of a medical harm perspective, that they don't want to see their children or grandchildren being harmed. So the language that we use when engaging with the elderly and the language that we use when engaging with youth are different and nuanced. But I think that makes the movement so much more dynamic. I think another way that youth can also engage in the movement most effectively is in terms of strategy. So I remember I was in Malaysia for a working group meeting of Malaysian activists who are working on FGMC. And in Asia, because the spotlight on FGMC is quite recent, the funding and the opportunity for activism for FGMC in Asia has only in the past maybe 3-4 years really been at the forefront. So right now it seems as if so there are organizations that are working on FGMC, but they are feminist organizations. So they're working on multiple topics. They're working on domestic abuse, gender-based violence, and also FGMC happens to be one of these issues. And so for many of these feminist organizations in Malaysia, I remember speaking to one of them who did the first research on FGMC in Malaysia. And she was saying that when she first did the research, their strategy was that they wanted to ban FGMC. They wanted to end it at all costs. But now she is a 65-year-old woman, and she's looking at the situation, and she said, that strategy hasn't worked. FGMC in Malaysia is still at 95% prevalence rate. So instead, so what my suggestion was that, instead of maybe criminalizing or banning it, we move to a different strategy, one where we remove the physical harm. So we regulate it such that the doctor or whoever is doing it doesn't actually do any physical harm on a baby. Perhaps they just wash the vulva. So of course, the issue of consent, of human rights violation is still present, but at least the physical harm is reduced. And she says that now looking at where we are at and how things have not changed, she is much more open to this strategy. It is not a perfect strategy. NFGC Singapore has received a lot of criticism for our strategy on international platforms. But also I think this is one that might work in our specific context. And I'm not advocating for it in any other context, but it's just one that is culturally contextual to where we are in Asia. Yeah.
Very powerful, Saza, and it is important to keep culture in mind as we, as youth activists, move forward in our own cultural spaces. Moving forward as well, Saza, I'd like to bring you up as well, unless someone has another option. As co-founder of End FGC Singapore, can you share more about your passion and advocacy to address FGMC and how that led to the creation of the organization?
Yeah, so, and Afika, who is here as well, who is also one of our core team members, feel free to also chime in the comments. I think, so after I found out that I was cut, I felt very, very angry and very violated, right? And then I wrote like 5 college papers on it because I was in college at that time. And then I eventually wrote my final thesis as well. And during this thesis, I interviewed 20 people. So I was trying to get a sense of, I think, women who have, or people who have survived FGMC. And so I interviewed people who were involved in a small movement to end FGMC. And so Afika is one of them. And a lot of these people talked about how violating it was. And I think at that point, my own emotional state was that I didn't want to be a victim, right? I didn't want to see myself as a victim. So I didn't want to fully believe, I think, in the harm that was caused. But speaking to these people gave me the power to, I think, overcome that sort of cognitive dissonance and to recognize that while this violation still has happened, I am still empowered. I still have bodily autonomy, even acknowledging and recognizing that this great harm has been done. So I think that's when it kind of started. And then in 2020, we started just a WhatsApp group. So just a WhatsApp group of different women who were involved in some form of activism against FGMC. And then it took off from there. So we started with a pilot study. So the largest pilot study of its kind in Singapore, where we did an online survey. So it's not peer reviewed, it's not a rigorous study, but it was just a pulse sensing. So we surveyed 360 Muslim women, and we found that 75% of Muslim women in Singapore have been cut. So the type of cutting done in Singapore is usually type 1 and type 4. Right now, it's been fully medicalized. So there are about 5 general practitioner clinics that we know who do it across the island. It's a very quick snip. I watched it being done in a doctor's clinic during my interviews. And yeah, the doctor cut something and we don't know what she's cutting. She probably doesn't either because it's not taught in any medical textbook. And it was very quick and very fast. So I think what we're trying to do with the movement now is to raise awareness. So when we ban something and the community is not ready, there will be backlash and we might take 2 steps back. So what we're trying to do is to re-educate kind of the populace, the Muslim population, to realize that this practice is not medical, it's not religious, and eventually to not do it. And we've had some successes with this. We recently had a father write in to our Instagram and said that he wanted to cut his daughter that afternoon, but in the morning he was researching about it, came across our page and decided not to do it. So little things like this. And we also distribute booklets at Ramadan bazaars, or we used to, and then now we are facing like a police investigation for it, so we can no longer do that because it's a Public Order Act violation in Singapore. Singapore is quite an authoritarian democracy. So that's one thing that we do. We also do local lobbying, so we speak regularly to our religious and healthcare leaders to talk to them about FGC and to push them for further regulation. So we have some success with that as well. Our Islamic Religious Council of Singapore 10 years ago said that FGC is compulsory, but today if you call in and you ask them, they will say there's a diversity of opinion. So it's not as good as what we want. What we want is for them to say that it's haram, right? That it's not at all permissible in Islam. But it is progress. We have seen that shift. And progress is incremental, right? In advocacy, things take decades to change. And we also do international lobbying. So we work with, so we submit to, for example, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So recently we were in Geneva to present our oral report. And we also speak on international media and platforms such as these. But I think my kind of approach to international lobbying has always been that because the spotlight on Asia is so recent, we need to understand the context of Asia before we speak about Asia, right? And I think we have things like the zero tolerance to NFGMC. We definitely agree with that. That is, we should be there, but we're not there yet. And so how do we get there in a way that is most productive for our cultural context? Yeah, so in summary, I think that's what we're doing with the movement.
Thank you so much, Saza. Moving for our next question. This next question is for Hunter and or Nur. As you are both currently students, in what ways has your academic experience, whether in law, healthcare, or just research, or personal experience, enhanced or informed your advocacy work?
Yeah, I can start if that's okay, Hunter. Okay. Yeah, so I first started getting involved with FGC prevention and advocacy in college. So I went to George Washington University, and so my mom told me about this practice when I was a teenager, because that was actually when there were a lot of court cases about our community. And so she wanted to make sure that my sister and I heard it from her and not from the news, I guess. Because by that point, my parents had left the community. So when I was a teenager, my mom told me about it, but it was always something, well, don't talk about it, And it wasn't even like, it was just like, well, it's not my story to tell, it's my mom's story to tell. And also I don't know how to tell people that I've known my whole life, or that know my mom. It's like weird for me to say something. But then I got to college and I took a women's health class, and that's when I met Dr. McDonald, who got me in contact with Sahiyo. So this is how it all connects for me. And I've been working with Sahiyo ever since. But I heard it talked about in an academic setting for the first time, and I never knew that it could be talked about, and that FGC could be talked about in an academic setting. And that's really what started it for me. Um, and striking a balance, I think it's hard. I also think that this topic is very emotional, and especially if you have some sort of like personal connection to it, it can be hard. And I think it's really important to take time for yourself. Um, do the work, but you can only do the work if you yourself are good. Um, so that is really important when you're striking a balance. But uh, I think it's just been helpful to find like-minded people. Like even just being here is like a great first step or a great step in general, because it makes you feel like you're not alone in the struggle and the fight. Um, and I agree with what Saza was saying that like you can't make like drastic changes. That's just not, I think, how advocacy works. But it's like, slowly, like you bring it up more in conversation. There's small steps. So even just like as a student, like, okay, I'll start bringing it up in class, or I'll talk about it to my friends. And then I'll maybe even branch out, talk about it like to my aunts and stuff. And like you're slowly getting like better at talking about it. And really that is such a perfect form of advocacy. Like never think that you're not doing enough. Because even just talking about FGC and female genital cutting and mutilation, that in and of itself is advocacy. Because for so long, and it continues to just be a practice of secrecy and stigmatization and silencing. So even just talking about it, that in and of itself is advocacy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nur. Hunter, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Nora that just talking about it is so important. And I think that classes and just being in that school community provides really great opportunity to spread awareness about FGC. And there's also just so many resources available to students that you can take advantage of and put towards advocacy. So I mentioned research before, but there's also, funding for student organizations if you wanted to start an organization or even work within an existing organization to do some fundraising or spreading awareness. There's really a lot of resources out there for students, and I think that it'd be great to channel that towards what you're passionate about, towards the movement and spreading awareness about FGC. And I actually had a pretty different experience from Nor. FGC was talked about in some of my college classes, but it wasn't in the way that I'd hoped for. And this came up in the video we watched earlier, that professors were sharing some misinformation about FGC in my classes and saying, it's a religious and cultural practice that needs to be protected. And I think it's really important for youth to educate themselves and be very ready to dispel these myths and fight back against those misconceptions that are really just so common.
I want to add
Absolutely.
something too. Just based on what Hunter said, I agree. Like, I think always be skeptical. I think it's really important to be skeptical. But if you hear someone saying something that sounds right and it feels like, no, that like this is what should be done. Like for me, I had a I had a professor give a guest lecture in one of my classes. It was during COVID, everything was on Zoom, but it was Dr. McDonald talking about female genital cutting and mutilation. And I literally just emailed her. And then for the next 2 years, I was doing research with her. So reach out. If you find someone that's doing really important work that you're like, I want to be a part of that, reach out. People want people in this business, in this line of work, not business, but like in this line of work, they want to help. They're excited that like the youth wants to like be in advocacy. And so reach out. Don't be like, well, I don't know, like I don't know if I know them. Just reach out. I still talk to Dr. McDonald. She's been a great mentor.
Absolutely. To build kind of off of that, even with my own students, I recognize how balancing academic responsibilities with one's commitment to social advocacy can be challenging. How have you and Hunter, been able to strike a balance? And what insights can you share about what has been helpful for you?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to incorporate your advocacy into your studies whenever possible. Um, like even just small things. I had to write an essay for a French class and I could choose any topic. And I thought, okay, well, this is a great chance for me to learn how to say FGC in French. And so, I wrote my essay about it and I learned some more of that vocabulary around it in French, which was great for me. And I also educated my professor about it. We had a great conversation. So, with our schoolwork, sometimes we have lots of work to do, and whenever it's possible to incorporate educating yourself and others about FGC into that, that's a great opportunity. I recommend taking that. And I've also incorporated my advocacy into my hobbies as well. Nora talks about the importance of, taking time for yourself and self-care. And for me, self-care is crocheting. I love it. It calms me down. And, sometimes I'll crochet things just for me, but sometimes I'll crochet tote bags that say end FGM. And I've donated those to Sahiyo's annual auction to help fundraise for FGM. So there's really a lot that you can do to incorporate it into your studies, and then also incorporate it into your free time.
Yeah, just going off of that, the tote bags. Yeah, I mean, I think once you get involved, um, like the advocacy will always be there. You don't have to do it 24/7. And so yeah, take time for yourself, find something that makes you happy. Burning out is not going to help anyone. And so take time for yourself, but the advocacy will always be there. So when you're ready and it feels right to you, it'll be there. And I think especially balancing school, like when I got involved and then it became part of like my school, like it was technically a research class that I was taking. It was like an undergraduate senior thesis. Then the lines can get a little bit blurry, I think. But I think it's more about just making sure that you take time regardless. And like even when you're doing schoolwork, you should take time. So especially when you're doing this, you should as well.
I have one more thing to add. It's also important to remind yourself that even when you're not working super directly on the movement, getting an education is so important and it's going to help you be a better advocate. Ever since starting medical school, I've definitely had less time than I used to volunteer with Sahiyo, and that made me really sad at first. But I try to remind myself that once I have a medical degree, I will be able to help survivors even more than I'm able to now. So, yeah, just try to remind yourself also if you're ever feeling guilty that you're not doing enough much, you are doing enough, and getting an education and becoming a well-rounded person is so important for you and for the movement.
Absolutely. And Hunter, I'm also an avid crocheter. Our next question is for Atika. Atika, in your introduction, you mentioned being a former diplomat for the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you are currently based in Hawaii. As a young advocate working across diverse cultural landscapes, what strategies have you found effective in addressing sensitive cultural issues around FGMC, especially in places where the practice is potentially less visible?
Hi, yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. So, just to give a little bit of background about the current situation in Hawaii, to date, we have had only one study on FGC in Hawaii, and it found that there are over 300 survivors living in Hawaii, and these numbers constitute a roughly 50-50 split between the Indonesian and Malaysian diaspora communities. So based on my personal experience, we now know that the actual numbers are higher. We can include other communities such as the Malay Muslim Singaporean diaspora community in Hawaii. And I think the issue with how invisible FGC in Hawaii is, it raises a huge concern. Could the lack of awareness potentially hinder our efforts to implement anti-FGC legislation? So Hawaii is one of the 9 remaining states in the US that has not outlawed FGC. And I think coming from a multicultural background, for me, the most effective strategies to address FGC, especially in places where it is less visible, first and foremost, there needs to be a lot of trust and relationship building. The goal should not be to condemn the practices, but instead to understand perspectives and to just really have an open and respectful conversation. The dialogue should focus on our shared values, such as, health, wellness, and the safety and well-being of children. This helps to create a lot of common ground and makes it easier to engage in constructive discussions. And I think, last but not least, it's also important to identify and provide resources for those who want to be change makers, because it's very crucial to have a local voice on the ground who's speaking up and speaking out and saying that just because this practice is less visible, that does not make it any less important.
Thank you so much for your perspective. For the rest of our panelists and for all of our panelists, as you reflect on your journey as an advocate, what did your advocacy against FGMC look like when you were younger? And how has it changed as you've grown, both in your professional life and your personal lives?
I can speak to this. I would say when I was younger and I first was learning more about FGC, I was very, very emotional about it. And I was really unsure how to talk to people who disagreed with me or even supported the continuation of FGC. And now I would say I'm still extremely passionate about it, but I think I've really learned how to control my emotions and be able to have those really difficult conversations with people who may not understand the need to end FGC or even support its continuation. And so I feel like that really comes from being in this being an advocate for a while, and you just learn a lot more about FGC. It's an incredibly nuanced issue. So if you're new to this topic and just trying to learn about it, don't get frustrated. There's a lot to learn, but it's something that anybody can get the hang of, and there's a lot of resources out there to teach you how to talk about FGC, what language to use. One of the biggest things I think I learned as someone starting out in this movement was not to use alienating language. I think when you learn about FGC for the first time, you can have a very visceral reaction and feel just so upset by it. And you may feel inclined to use terms like that, just very, very strong language, like disgusting, or I've heard the word barbaric used a lot. And then I think as you grow in this movement, you realize it's much more nuanced than that. People who are performing FGC, they're not doing this with the intention of hurting their daughters. So it's really important to understand that there is a lot of misinformation out there, and you can be an advocate for change and spreading awareness about the truths about FGC.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add on to that. I think just based on my personal observation, I definitely see the narrative surrounding FGC changing. Like, in the past, people used to really believe that it was, for example, compulsory from a religious angle, and that if you don't carry out FGC, and then your daughter will grow up to be sexually promiscuous. But now, with more people talking about the practice and just people having more open conversations, people are starting to realize that FGC really is just it is a cultural tradition, and it is our responsibility as youth to have the conversation, to shed light and awareness on the issue, and understand that we have to be the voices for change.
Yeah, I think going off both what Atiqah and Hunter said, I really agree with what Hunter said. It's difficult to. I think a lot of people have like a visceral reaction to FGMC, or FGC, which is fair. And I know I did when I first heard it too. But um, it's hard to make change if you're alienating the people that you're trying to change. And so I think it's really important to try to understand. Like I think when I was younger, I was like, oh my God, it's like I was mad about it. I didn't want to talk to my aunts that believed in it. I was like, no, 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 no. But now slowly it's the like you can't change people's minds by dismissing them, I think, or even trying to change their minds, or just having a discussion with them. And so I think as I've gotten older, I've also, I think when I was younger, I didn't want to talk about it at all, or I wouldn't tell my close friends. And now, like through college, I started, okay, I'll tell the people close to me. And now, like in law school, I call this my side hustle. I'll be like, okay, I have to go do work on my side hustle, and it's like my activism work. But like all my friends know what that means. And I think you get just as you age, I think you get better at talking about this. But also the anger is good and it's important, but it's not sustainable. And so feel it, but then do something better for yourself as well. And don't let it like control your whole life.
Absolutely. And Saza, is there anything you'd like to share as well?
Yeah, maybe just a very quick one. I do think that along the way, the advocacy, I think FGMC advocacy, I think any advocacy demands bravery, right? I think it demands courage. It demands speaking up. It demands doing things that are sometimes bending the law. And so I think that's something that I've seen in my work. And even I think it's easy to equate, I think, legality with morality, but that's often not true. So I think with people like Atiqah who are courageous to, for example, just distribute booklets at Ramadan bazaars about FGMC, right? Which you wouldn't think is a criminal act, but it can be in a country like Singapore. So I think it demands some sort of bravery, not to scare you off doing the advocacy work, but I think it's something to think about is also maybe your kind of role in the social change ecosystem. So there's a theory about how there are 16 roles in the social change ecosystem, right? And so some of them are things like disruptors. And so these are the people who might get in trouble with the law often. But you also have roles like storytellers, visionaries, carers, healers, right? And these are the people who are not necessarily on the ground protesting, but the work that they are doing to continue oral traditions, to take care of the people who are on the ground, these are just as essential for the movement. So I think to think yourself what your skills are, where your competencies lie, and what your role can be, and what you're most comfortable playing in the movement. I think all these roles are equally important. So just kind of reflect on that.
Thank you so much, Saza. And you've spoken at length about some of the legal challenges that you have faced when you first started advocating, and the ways that you're overcoming them. For the rest of our panelists as well, what other challenges did you face when you first started advocating? And what advice would you give to folks who may not know where to start? And I know some folks have provided that advice already, so if there's anything else you'd like to add, feel free to do so.
Like Nur said earlier, do not be afraid to reach out to people. This movement will absolutely embrace you. I've met some of the most incredible people in the movement to end FGC. And I feel like I can't think of a single time where I've emailed somebody wanting to know more about their work or just with a question for them where they didn't respond. I mean, people are very responsive and very willing to bring more people into this movement. So yes, definitely don't be afraid to reach out to anybody whose work you're interested in, or if you think that you can contribute in some way, please, please, please reach out. And the other advice I'd give is, personally, I'm not from a community that practices FGC. And in the beginning, I wondered, do I belong in this movement? Is this my place? And I've really realized I've been very embraced by this movement, and I've realized that every movement in the world needs allies. So if you're like me and you're not from a place where FGC is practiced, you can still absolutely contribute.
Absolutely. And thank you, Hunter, for leading us right into our next question as well. How can allies help support youth-led initiatives to end FGC? communities that are not impacted by FGC or governments and NGOs in your perspective or any of our other panelists' perspectives?
Sure, well, I can just continue a little bit what I was saying. As an ally, I think it is really important to always defer to and learn from the people who are in communities that practice FGC. So, absolutely be involved in this movement, but remember, it's always so important for you to listen to the people who come from those communities or have experienced FGC themselves. Stay humble and stay open-minded.
Thank you. Atiqah, I think you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add on to what Hunter just said. And I think the important thing for allies is to just keep the conversation going because, there still remains a taboo in the communities that do practice FGC to actually speak up and speak out against the practice of FGC. So as an ally, if you keep the conversation going, you help to break down this barriers to talking about FGC and essentially just raise greater awareness about it because these attitudes that are supporting FGC, I feel they do tend to be deeply entrenched amongst people that are from the older generations. So, as youth, as allies, it's our responsibility to just help to work towards the change in the narrative surrounding FGC.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and sorry.
No, please, Nur.
Going off what Atiqah and Hunter said and what everyone has said, I also think that allies sometimes can do things that people from the community can't do, whether if that's pressure from the family, fear of ostracization, which I think that I have witnessed a lot. And so I think it's important to also realize that, like, you may have a gift that no one else has, and that's that you wouldn't necessarily face some sort of backlash from your own family or your own community by just joining the fight.
Absolutely. Does anyone have anything else to add? Saza, do you have any thoughts as well? Or no? Okay. So this has been a fantastic conversation. And I think we have lots of questions from the audience. So I'm going to dive right in so we don't run out of time. As a note, if we do run out of time, we don't get a chance to answer your question, don't worry. Keep an eye out on Sahiyo's social media and our social media through NFGC Singapore as well to see some answers from our panelists in the future. So our first audience question really dives into some previous conversations about shame. Can any of the panelists share how they have helped community women and girls come out of the shame and fear to bring their voices out into the journey to ending FGMC? And how do you deal with the side of that community that might pride themselves in the practice and those who mock the fight against FGC and who are either in ignorance or completely neutral to why we say no to FGMC?
Okay, so I feel like that question has two parts. So it sounds like the first part is how to create spaces for people to feel open to share their experiences. Well, in my experience, I'm doing research on the husband stitch, and the husband stitch is a non-consensual additional stitch placed after childbirth with the purpose of tightening the vaginal opening, out most likely for the purpose of improving the male partner's sexual pleasure, or maybe also out of tradition and culture. And before I did this project, there was really no research on the husband stitch. And so, working with my mentor, Dr. Sayan, we decided the best place to start would be hearing from the woman that this has happened to and highlighting their experiences and validating in a peer reviewed publication that this is real and this is happening to them. So, I think research can be a very powerful way to create safe spaces for women to share their stories. It's confidential, it's private, it's a one on one conversation. And so I think that that can be a really strong way to highlight people's voices. And the second part of that question, What's the second part again?
Sure. How do we deal with the side of the community that does pride themselves in the practice of FGC, or those who mock the fight against the act, and are completely either in ignorance or blank of why we're saying no to FGC?
Oh, yeah, those conversations are so hard. That is such a good question. Some techniques I've found that help me is start by asking them questions and get a really good understanding of their perspective. Um, Asking people questions will also help them feel a little bit more open to talk to you, rather than jumping to being defensive. So ask them questions, understand where they're coming from. Um, Always remembering there are a lot of misconceptions about FGC. So instead of coming at it with the perspective of, this person is evil, they want FGC to continue, instead try to have them with the perspective of, okay, this person has some misconceptions. So I'm going to say, hey, that is such a common myth. But actually, this is the truth about FGC, and just, share what you know. So that's some advice that I could give for that. But those conversations are really hard, and I wish you all the best of luck with those.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any? Oh, Saza.
Yeah. So in Singapore, the Muslim community is a minority community, right? And so so the Muslim community gets defensive if we criticize anything about their culture, because it's minority, it's marginalized, and therefore they hold on much more strongly to culture and tradition. So I think understanding that perspective and to then acknowledge it and say that, I'm from the same community. And this is not, I'm not trying to attack the community, but rather this is something harmful that is being done, and it does not need to be a community tradition. It does not need to be part of our culture. There was something called teeth filing, where they will file like the teeth down, as that is seen as attractive, and this happened decades ago. But it's something which was a culture in the community, but then it just faded out because it's also not medical, it's also harmful. So I think there is precedence for harmful community practices to die off. And so just recognizing that this is not culture, this is not tradition. I think the second strategy is also that we don't need to convince everyone. What is the highest kind of return of investment on our efforts, right? Because we do have limited time and energy. So to think of how there are people who will never have their minds changed, no matter how much you logically argue with them. And those are lost cause, then forget it. But then you have the middle ground, new parents, young parents who are questioning and who are thinking about these things, then maybe those are the best people that we can reach out to. So to think of how we can best then channel our advocacy efforts to them. And then we have the people who are already on our side, and how do we maybe turn them into our advocates in the communities as well. So to have maybe a multi-pronged advocacy strategy to reach out to different audiences.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Moving forward to our next audience question. Does social media play a part, especially so that it becomes known or becomes loud and our voices are platformed and felt as or is it felt as not okay for youth?
I can talk a little bit. So, I'll be honest, I struggled with the social media aspect, just at, at first and even now a little bit, just because it feels so public, and it feels so exposed. When I put something like that on my profile or my page or anything like that. But I'm slowly, I think, getting better at it, and I think it's a great avenue, for uh, just spreading awareness, which I think is such an important part of FGC advocacy. But yeah, I just wanted to say that like struggling with the social media aspect it's okay. It's I still struggle with that just because it is so very, I feel like naked, so very exposing. But yeah, just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. It can feel very open and public. Um, has anyone had any experience using social media as parts of their advocacy?
I'd be happy to add about the social media aspect. So, right now I'm helping an FGC Singapore working on their social media campaign. And I think the amazing thing about using social media for anti-FGC advocacy is just because, FGC is an issue that does not have borders, and social media is something that can have a wide global reach. It has the potential to go viral. And I think something else that is also important for us to acknowledge with the use of social media is there are a lot of voices surrounding FGC, and not all of them might be comfortable putting a face to their voice. And with social media, you do have that option. You can choose whether or not you want to display your real personality when you're speaking up and speaking out about FGC. And if you're not comfortable doing so, you can just hide behind your online persona. So I think that's great because, people have varying levels of whether or not they're comfortable having other people in their community know that they are talking about this issue. So I think those are some of the factors surrounding the use of social media for FGC.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Continuing on, this question's for, again, always to all of the panelists. I'm curious if in advocacy, one of our audience questions was, I'm curious if in your advocacy experience, you have encountered people who compared FGC to the prevalence of male circumcision and how to navigate conversations around the gender divide.
So we have received questions like that. And I think our stance has always been, I think male circumcision also has the same issues usually of consent and human rights violations, right? Because they are also usually done on babies or children less than 21. So the same issues arise, but I say that as like FGM is a huge issue that we're tackling already. If you are interested in this, please go start your own MGM organization. You don't expect us to do everything. So yeah, I would recommend people to start their own organizations. But I think our stance has also just always been from a human rights kind of perspective, right?
I think going off of what, oh, sorry.
You're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Going off what Saza just said, yeah, I've definitely been asked that question before as well. And I remember my mentor, Dr. McDonald, used to say, of course, that's an important issue, but like the least invasive form of FGC is equivalent to castration. So let's also acknowledge the differences. But also, yeah, I think what I've said and what I think it's important to say is that it doesn't have to be either or. Just because we're doing FGC and FGM activism and advocacy doesn't mean that you shouldn't also do male circumcision advocacy. That's just kind of like Saza said, maybe that's not what I'm doing. But it doesn't have to be either or.
I'd be happy to add on to that. And I think something that struck me when I first started learning about FGC, and this is probably more from a medical perspective. So Hunter, if I'm wrong on this, please feel free to jump in. But I think I did notice a huge difference between male and female circumcision, which is I believe there are men who are not circumcised when they were infant or young children who in their adulthood decided to undergo the procedure for a variety of reasons, for example, health reasons. But I do believe that equivalent does not exist in women. And I might be wrong on that, but I personally have not heard of any experiences of women who are not circumcised as infants or young girls, eventually deciding in their adulthood to be like, okay, I would like to undergo the practice of FGC. And I think that discrepancy just highlights, how different the issue is between the two genders. And that does not mean that, the issue of male circumcision is not a problem. It just, they happen to be two different issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hunter, I also believe that you had something to say as well on this issue.
The other panelists already said everything so perfectly. I have nothing to add.
Fantastic. Thank you. As we continue to talk about men and their involvement as allies, what recommendations do you have for young boys to become aware of how damaging FGC is and how they can help? And I think this is actually also a great opportunity to platform Sahiyo, which is Sahiyo's program that incorporates young men into the advocacy and to protect their daughters and sisters. But if no one has any other responses to those, we can also move on to the other audience questions and reach out with some resources about Sahiyo for those who might be interested in the audience. So moving forward about advocacy experience for people who may be older and may have gone through menopause already. What are your thoughts about intergenerational knowledge sharing and its empowerment and its impact on youth advocacy? Looks like maybe this one might be a question we want to consider. Oh, of course, Atiqah. What are your thoughts about intergenerational knowledge sharing and working with older women or survivors who have maybe gone through menopause and are experiencing FGC post menopause and things like that, or experiencing the after effects of FGC post menopause?
Thank you for repeating the question. I actually do have some thoughts on this. So, in my research on the husband stitch, I have heard from women who are going through menopause and are still experiencing the effects of the husband stitch, and essentially complications of the husband stitch and FGC is sexual dysfunction. It can make sex painful, decrease libido, and really all sorts of things. So in menopause, estrogen levels drop. And so therefore, so does vaginal lubrication. So vaginal dryness is really a very big issue in menopause. And so, that really exacerbates the sexual dysfunction that occurs in women who've undergone FGC. So menopause can really amplify the health impacts of FGC and the husband stitch. So I think medical care for women who have undergone FGC and are now going through menopause is really essential. There are treatments for the vaginal dryness of menopause. So, that's all really important. However, people who have been through FGC, the husband stitch, they've been through these non-consensual procedures on their genitals. And so you can imagine that will make people feel less comfortable going to a physician and being in that kind of vulnerable position again. So, that brings up the point of trauma-informed care is so important for survivors of gender-based violence. So yeah, it's a really complicated issue because menopause is going to potentially amplify some of these health complications, and it can be really challenging for people who have been through FGC to get treatment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. So our next question kind of goes back to social media as well. Are there any less private methods of online social media that might be used to help spread publicity, which is so needed? or online anonymous platforms that you have used in your advocacy or recommend using for those who might not feel like putting their name to their survivorship or their advocacy?
Yeah, so for NFGC, for the core team, not all of us are comfortable with our faces and our names being on the platform. So we will do like, let's say our hands or our backs, or we'll put stickers on the faces to anonymize it. And we also, for a time, I think, drew some caricatures of people and then had pseudonyms to so I think there are a variety of ways to kind of anonymize your contributions to the movement. And yeah, just got to be kind of creative about it to still be aesthetic.
Fantastic. Thank you, Saza, for such creative ideas all around anonymizing. I think caricatures are fantastic, and the use of stickers for webinars is a brilliant plan. All right, so I think we are coming to the close of our audience questions. We have just one final question. For all of our panelists, as an advocate, what are your hopes for the future of FGMC advocacy?
That it will end. Right? I think for sure, I think that's all our futures. Our vision at NFGC is a Singapore where the practice of FGMC is obsolete. And so I think that's where we're headed towards. I was reminded of a quote yesterday. The path of history is long, but it tends towards justice. I think I'm butchering it. But I strongly believe in this, and I think our advocacy also needs to continue to be intersectional. And we need to kind of keep on pushing that so that we continue to be sensitive and nuanced in our strategies.
Absolutely. I think, and I'm sure I'm going to invite the other panelists to share as well. It would be lovely to be able to advocate ourselves out of a job with this. From our other panelists as well, what are your thoughts and hope?
I'd be happy to add on to what Saza said. So, obviously the goal for all of us here would be for the practice of FGC to eventually end completely. And I think to add on to that, if or when we eventually get to that point, I also hope that we can reflect and look back on the very long, very difficult journey that it took to get us to that point, and hopefully have some deep introspection and understand that, perhaps in the past we were wrong to carry out this practice, and that we have come so far, we have grown and learned during the process. And that is my hope for that, to get to the point where just everyone who is involved or even not involved in the communities that do practice FGC to be able to have a very comfortable and open dialogue about it, to not have to worry about having to be anonymous and hide our faces for fear of repercussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Atiqah. Hunter?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Saza said for FGM to end. But from my perspective, I'm becoming a doctor, and if FGC ended tomorrow, there would still be countless women who need care. FGC causes lifelong complications, physical, sexual, and mental. So for me, I really hope that the future of this movement includes a lot more education among physicians on trauma-informed care practices and specifically treating the complications of FGC. And I know there's a lot of great people doing that work, but I just hope that that can continue to grow.
Thank you so
And just
much,
going off
Hunter.
of what, just going off of what everyone has said, I think, hopefully FGC will no longer be a current practice. I hope that my children don't feel any shame or any need to be silent on the matter. And it's just, one more generation where you're making a difference. Those are my hopes.
Thank you, everyone who has participated and sent questions. And thank you to all of our panelists for answering these questions. That brings us to the close of our audience Q&A. But of course, if you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to Sahiyo. Our panelists and our youth advocates are always happy to continue talking. So thank you so much for this wonderful, rich discussion. And we shall continue on with some additional resources. So we have just a few last items we'd like to share with you before we leave. We're preparing those resources now and getting those screens shared. All right. Our next resource, we want to share with you a moment to hear some more activists and more wonderful voices speaking up. We wanted to take a moment to share with you all this wonderful new podcast called the Purple Chair Podcast. The Purple Chair Podcast is designed to showcase the power of youth-led activism, uncover hidden stories, and challenge societal norms, all while inspiring collective action towards a future free from FGM and GBV, gender-based violence. The project aims to enhance the skills and visibility of young women from FGM-affected diaspora in Europe, promoting youth social entrepreneurship and the effective use of digital tools like social media in advocacy. The series features 6 remarkable young women from FGM-affected communities, Basmala, Cynthia, Imtanan, Leah, Nabia, and Shahrafat, who will share their experiences and activism. Created by the End FGM European Network with financial support from Erasmus Plus and logistical support from Are We Europe, the Purple Chair Podcast is a collaborative effort with partners including Save a Girl, Save a Generation in Spain, Atiqah in Ireland, FSAN in the Netherlands, and Forward UK in the United Kingdom. There will be links in the chat, and we invite you to tune into this podcast. I'm going to post the link. And for one last thing, for those who are interested in learning more about Sahiyo's Voices to End FGMC project, we are sharing links in the chat for you to check out our digital stories and podcast series launched for more in-depth discussions with some of the voices storytellers about FGMC. And we are just going to really quickly share those links to Purple Chair and the Voices to End FGMC podcast. Our final one is we are going to launch one final poll for you all to share your feedback on today's webinar. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please share them in the chat or feedback for us to how do we improve. These webinars cannot be done without you, and we're so grateful for your presence. All right, I'm going to share those links while you guys are responding to the poll. Thank you all for joining us today. For anyone who still has questions that did not get answered during our panel discussion, please be sure to follow us on social media for more answers from our panelists. And thank you for your feedback and your interest in our webinar, Youth Advocates Against Female Genital Cutting, FGC, a conversation on change. I think